So Walter, you've had a really fascinating life experience, a number of different transitions in your life, and I think it'd be a good idea for us to start all the way back at the very beginning, when you made your transition as a young man from Germany to Uruguay. So could you fill us in a little bit about how that transition occurred and some of the important elements of it?
Well, it wasn't really as a young man. I was 7 years old, and in 1938, and on November 9, Kristallnacht, my father had been arrested. My mother the next day, on November 10, got visas to go to Uruguay, and with that my father was released. And on November 18, 8 days later, we board ship going to Uruguay. So I have some vague memory of Germany, but all my childhood memories are growing up in Uruguay.
So your parents must have been really fairly prescient about what some of the issues were going to be to have already started the process for emigration as early as 1938.
Well, unfortunately not. It was after the Kristallnacht. And as a matter of fact, when my father was released, his reaction was, let's go to Belgium till this madness blows over. And my mother said, no, out of Europe. And so it was, I wish could say there had been more provisions. We had relatives, etc. I had two aunts, for example, I was very close, who left Frankfurt in '33, went to Holland, got caught, were in Bergen-Belsen, survived that, and then went back to Amsterdam. And when I was studying in Paris, I saw them quite a few times. And from that point of view. But you asked me about my childhood, my upbringing, and growing up in Uruguay was probably the most decisive thing in my formative situation. Number of things. Number one, while we had gotten there in '38, much of the Jewish immigration viewed this as a temporary measure. And so contrary to what we have in this country, the melting pot, that didn't exist. On the other side, we as children acclimated completely. So I was living in the two environments, in the Jewish community on one side and in the general community on the other. So I had learned to function in different environments from early childhood. And I could communicate and translate concepts and ideas to my parents, so forth. I have a sister who is 4 years younger than I. She lives in Israel now with several of her children. And so during those years, the 1940s, Uruguay was probably the closest thing to paradise you could think in those years. It was a democratic country where democracy was tremendously important. It was a highly educated country. There was in those years no analphabetism. And I don't mean just a low percentage, there was no analphabetism. School system, education was excellent, modeled after the French system. And so I had the opportunity of having an excellent education, first in the public school system, and then later on, and I don't know if we have time to go into that, into a private British school that was created. And it was created in 42 or 43, I can't remember the time. with me in the first class, which again pictures why I have so much deference to authority, because I never had upperclassmen. I was always the upper class.
Always the senior member, even in elementary school?
Exactly. Not in elementary school, but in high school, in middle school, high school, etc. So that was, and we had an excellent education system. We were 12 students in our class. And contrary to the kind of education we have here, we had a number of teachers who followed us throughout the 4 years. I had one particular professor who taught us mathematics and philosophy, Ismael de San Martin, who was absolutely excellent. And if anything, he was one of the most formative elements. And so there were a number of other things, and contrary again to the situation here in this country, where you go to college and then decide after doing an undergraduate degree what you want to do, we basically had to decide at age 16 what kind of direction we were going to go, because the second part of pre-university preparatory was divided into sciences, law, other things, etc. So you had to make a decision which direction you were going.
Right. And so what were the influences that caused you to go toward that science direction?
Well, my originally desire was to go into medicine. And so I did what I have done throughout my life. I tested it. I got very well acquainted with a physician, went with him on rounds, and started asking what he was doing and why he was doing things. And after querying, etc., and realizing that most of the decisions, many of the decisions, were based on experience, good judgment, etc., in a word, good guesswork, I did not feel comfortable in making recommendations or decisions on another human being if I didn't have precise information. So that's when I decided to go into chemistry. As a matter of fact, I started medical school, and that reinforced my negative view of medicine. So I went into chemistry. We didn't have a career in pure chemistry at that time, so I started pharmacy. But at the same time, we started a new school at the university, which was Letters, Arts and Sciences. I enrolled there in chemistry. I was one of 2 students enrolling in that. And because students had so much involvement in how the universities were run, I ended up being chairman of the committee that set the curriculum for the career I was going to follow.
Well, that's convenient.
So I wrote my own curriculum.
Truly directed study, right?
Absolutely. And it turns out, because at age 17, 18, you have a certain limitation and flexibility. What I put together was so difficult that years later it had to be changed, toned down, because very few could follow up on that. But anyhow, and so I did a number of things that were new. For example, one thing I did, I decided I needed a good course in mathematics. I didn't like what was offered in my thing. I didn't like what was offered in engineering or in pharmacy, etc. But I found out there was a good course in mathematics in the School of Architecture. I went there, talked to the professor, said, can I sit in your course and take the tests, etc.? Sure. So I practiced interdisciplinarity, not because I wanted to be interdisciplinary, but because it was a logical thing to do.
Sure. And you wanted to take the best associated
Exactly.
with each of those disciplines.
Exactly.
Right.
And so I followed on that. So then the professor at the chemistry in the Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias had come also as a refugee in 41 from France. He was originally from Austria, fled in 38, went to Paris, or 37, went to Paris, and then managed to flee through Spain to Uruguay. And so I was educated by him. And there were others. And so I had an excellent education because there were very few. And so that was then. And because of his connections in France, I got a fellowship to go to Paris. And so I did my Ph.D. studies in Paris.
Before we get to that, talk a little bit about that mentor, and what kind of guidance did that particular individual have for you as you were going through your educational career?
Well, he taught me organic chemistry. He taught me how to develop scientific work. It was interesting because we were doing the synthesis of some sulfonamides, and I got a product that didn't quite look like a sulfonamide, SO2, and I analyzed it, and it was a sulfoxide, only one oxygen. And I realized that I had used an older bottle of hydrogen peroxide, which had lost some of its potency, and because of that I was catch the intermediate reaction. So that was one of my first exposures to kinetics, rate of reactions, and the fact never taking anything for granted, analyzing, measuring, etc. And that was the first paper I published. So I was fully participant, and it was a wonderful education because it allowed me free rein to do things and develop things, etc. And we had a wonderful environment and could do a number of things.
It sounds like it was a very collaborative opportunity.
Absolutely.
So why did you then continue in that mentor's vein within Paris? What was it about that area of investigation that you wanted to continue?
Well, when I went to Paris, it was not to continue what I had done in Montevideo, but it was to work in the what Professor Roche, I went to the Collège de France, which had been founded in 1532, and which was an independent research university. It was affiliated with the University of Paris, but was an independent research independent institute. And we had discussed by mail, etc., that I would work on elucidating the structure of streptomycin. So I was all prepared. I had read everything I could about streptomycin, etc. I get to Paris, meet with Roche, Professor Jean Roche, and he tells me, Walter, welcome here, etc. By the way, I had another student come last week, and I gave him the streptomycin project. Would you mind working on thyroid hormones? So my answer was, I'll be delighted to work on thyroid hormones. When I got out of his office, I caught the first other student or who was downstairs, etc. Tell me, what are thyroid hormones? Okay? So sometimes you plan on things, and sometimes you get faced with something that you don't expect, but you take the opportunity.
Right.
And there was a wonderful opportunity to work on thyroid hormones because it was an area that thyroxine had been discovered in 1915 by Kendall. And in 1953, the concept was that we know everything about thyroid hormones and there's nothing to be done. Well, it turns out both our laboratory in Paris and a parallel laboratory in England had discovered triiodothyronine, T3, 3,5,3' triiodothyronine. So the whole field got upset. And so my charge was, what is the mechanism of biosynthesis of thyroid hormones? And having been trained as an organic chemist, I set out to synthesize some of the thyroid hormones and how to make them. And again, I found something very similar. The problem I had encountered in Montevideo with the sulfoxide and sulfonamides is that by an accident, I found that instead of deiodinating to the 3 and 5 position simultaneously, I could deiodinate only 1 because it was a stepwise reaction, and so I could catch the intermediate. And so these two things highlighted for me the concept and the importance of kinetics. So the fact that rate processes mattered was very critical, and I have used that ever since.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the process, I became quite an expert in chemistry of iodine, not because of some grand plans that I was becoming an expert in iodine, but because I was walking into a field that was relatively open, and I seized it.
Opportunity.
Exactly.
Opportunity.
I used that opportunity.
So now, when you made that transition from Uruguay to Paris,
Yes.
you had been in a very individualistic environment within Uruguay, and now you're working directly with a mentor in Paris. And how did you have flexibility around that, number one? And number two, were you able to also to be able to maintain that interdisciplinary focus that you had when you started with in Uruguay?
The answer to that was no and yes. Paris, France at that time, and probably still today, is a very ordered, regimented society. And coming from the atmosphere in Uruguay, I was not regimented. The first 2 years in Paris, I was trying to adapt, and then I decided, what the hell? And I said pejoratively that I was walking around with a sign saying, "Careful, savage South American." So I did what came naturally to me, and it was fine.
Right. So you made Paris adapt to you.
Well, in a sense.
Which is not surprising.
In a sense. For example, the way the laboratory in Paris was organized, we had the big professor at the top of the pyramid, Jean Roche, who, by the way, later became president of the University of Paris, recteur. And we had then, under him, several subgroups. And Raymond Michel, was head of our thyroid hormone group. And he was terribly upset that I would go and talk to Roche directly without going through him. But I couldn't figure out why he wanted to do that, and I just did it. And so Roche and I became good friends and communicated, etc. And so it was interesting because I wasn't a threat because I was not part of the French system, and therefore I was allowed to do things that a Frenchman who should do as is expected,
right,
as is traditional, might not have.
mm-hmm.
And so it was very interesting. Let me relate another story which is illustrative. When we do our Ph.D., we have 3 examiners. So the thing is the chairman of the committee, which is your major professor, a rapporteur, which is the person who is supposed to tear you down and find all the problems on it,
Mm-hmm.
and a third person who is supposed to keep the peace between the other two. That's how the committees are put together. I was in a rather difficult situation because the person who did the Ph.D. before me had problems that were not his fault, goofed terribly, and his Ph.D. was a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were walking out, Roche turns to me and says, "Walter, you are next. You will defend the honor of the laboratory, l'honneur du laboratoire." Okay, I knew what was coming. The person who was assigned to me as my rapporteur, the one to tear me down, was Edgar Ledrer, and he had the reputation of being terribly tough. Everybody warned me about that.
Mm-hmm.
Went to see Ledrer, started chatting, and we spent 2 hours chatting. It turns out, of those 2 hours chatting, I listened for an hour and a half, him opening up how difficult it was for an Austrian Jew to function in the French environment and all the difficulties he had.
Mm-hmm.
He felt I was somebody who could open up. He couldn't talk to anybody else because they were part of the system.
Sure.
So he opened up and got all the things he had out. And at the end he said, "Walter, by the way, I read your thesis. It's excellent. Don't worry."
So you preserved the honor. You.
When I came back to the laboratory, I obviously wasn't going to tell that. Said, "How did your visit with Ledrer go?" "Oh, it was quite difficult. He asked some very difficult questions, but I think I was able to answer them." "Okay, wonderful. Let's hope so." Okay, so I'm just giving examples
Sure.
of the kind of things.
So because they were so regimented from the description around the laboratories as well as the institute, were there opportunities for collaboration? Did you have ways that you might be able to reach out to some of the other disciplines at that stage in your career?
Well, the answer again is an unequivocal and definitive yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
One of the customs in the laboratory was when you had a group meeting and discussed research results, etc., you were careful to erase the blackboard so that the other group coming into that same room wouldn't see what you were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so because I, again, my Uruguayan background, that didn't sit too well, I was working on some compounds, and I read a paper synthesizing very similar compounds, which was published by a professor at the University of Southern California, Norman Karash.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote to him to establish some contact and discuss areas of common interest. And that's how I got connected with USC.
Interesting.
Because of that. And Michel was absolutely furious. "You are a student. You don't contact people outside." Okay. So at that time, that was 56. By the way, my girlfriend in Uruguay had come to England to study, and then she decided Paris was more interesting to study. So Gladys came to Paris, and we got married in '55. I'd promised my parents not to get married before I had finished my Ph.D. By '55, I was nearly finished, so
close
did
enough.
that. And at that time in '56, there was a movement in Latin America to build up Latin American universities. And there was a university in Concepcion, a private university, not a state university, which was trying to build, and they went all over Europe recruiting South American scientists. There was another Uruguayan who was studying in Cambridge, and he recommended me. So the Chileans came to Paris, interviewed me, and being offered a professorship at the mature age of 25 sounded rather interesting. And by that time, the idea of going back to South America was appealing. And so in '56, we went to Chile. Well, the promises were all there. The implementation of those promises didn't quite work out because the economic situation, the structure of the country was such that you couldn't reproduce in a completely different social environment what I was used to in Europe and in Uruguay, which is an academic environment which is mostly adapted to middle-class values, hard work, etc. The students there were either very wealthy families, so they didn't have to work, or they were from poorer backgrounds, had gotten fellowship, etc., and didn't have time to dilly-dally. They needed to get a job.
Sure.
So I didn't feel I really could build things up.
Because neither one of those groups are going to be focusing on creativity and some of the issues that we know we have to go through in discourse. Yeah.
Exactly. That was the situation. So in the meantime, I had kept in contact with Norman Courage by mail, contacted me again to come to USC. By the time he made an offer, I had already accepted a position in Amherst, Amherst, Massachusetts, which through various contacts. And so I said, well, let me be in touch when I'm in Amherst and then see. So in '58, we came to the United States and settled in Amherst. And that was very interesting, and I can go into all kind of interesting social things about what Protestant New England was in their time, etc.
Small town New England.
Small town New England. Let me give you just one incident that is quite funny. George Kidder, who was the professor who had hired me, first day arrived, drove me around, and suddenly says, oh, here's the Catholic Church. Okay. Few minutes later, he says, oh, we have Catholic universities in this country, but they're not very good. By that time, I figured out what was going on. So a few blocks later, I said, are there any synagogues
I was
around
wondering
here?
whether you were going to get to temples.
Would you believe I heard an audible sound of relief? I was coming from South America, and he assumed I was Catholic. The fact I was Jewish was acceptable. Catholic would not have been acceptable. So that's how I learned all those kind of things, etc.
And was there a synagogue?
Oh, yes.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, yes, there was. And so I got things, etc. So learned a lot. It was a wonderful year. But then by that time, Norman was reiterating his offer, and I had other offers, etc., which I was tempted, but they didn't come through in right time. As a matter of fact, not going to go into all that. But so in August 59, I arrived here in Los Angeles, and we had breakfast at the Figueroa Hotel on Figueroa Street, right next to campus. It doesn't exist anymore. And so that was my introduction to Los Angeles.
So Gladys is going through some pretty big changes here too. I mean, in terms of the family moving back to South America, but to Chile, and then to Amherst, and then USC. How did that influence the whole family process?
Well, there were difficult times. Gladys was my wife. She passed away 3 years ago. So I mean, but Gladys did not like Chile very much because of the kind of social environment, etc. People were wonderful, but there was a very sharp division from a social point of view. I can go into that in detail, but I think we have covered a lot of pre-USC history and try to. And so the idea that first winter in Amherst was wonderful. Coming here to Los Angeles, she loved it. She adapted it, etc. She developed her own career, which if we have time, we go into that. And so really we felt at home once we were here.
So that transition, it was all good through that whole process.
Exactly.
Then. That's great. That's really good.
It was.
So what was USC like in 1959?
Okay. When I came to USC in 59, I came to the Department of Chemistry, which had a world-class reputation. And that was one of the attractions, etc. I would say the rest of the university was at a different level. I came also 1 year after Norman Topping became president. And of all the people I have known in upper administration, he is the one who probably more than anybody else changed the nature of USC from what we could have called in those years a reasonable but second-class provincial university to what is now a world-class university. He initiated that and did much of that.
How did he do it?
Sorry?
How did he do it?
Recruiting good people, changing the culture, but above all, recruiting people. And let me tell you how I came to chemistry. I was a postdoctoral there, and that was August. And come September, classes start. And there was a course being taught in the School of Pharmacy called Organic Chemistry. And the gentleman who was teaching at Glenhammer had gotten a sabbatical.
Sure.
And they'd hired a replacement. And I think 1 week before class, that person decided, no, I'm not coming. So the dean of pharmacy comes running to chemistry. I need somebody to teach organic chemistry. There were 3 of us postdoctorals who could do it. One was negotiating a job in Wichita on the faculty, so he was not interested. Other one was going into industry to Texas. He was not interested. So I was low man on the totem pole.
You drew the short straw then, huh?
And I landed it. And so I was hired to teach organic chemistry to the pharmacy students.
And this was back when pharmacy was right across from Bovard, right?
Exactly, the old building.
Yes.
And I was given very extensive directions how to teach organic chemistry. Walter, you teach organic chemistry. Now remember, I had organic chemistry in high school. I had organic chemistry in pre-pharmacy. And I had organic chemistry then as a graduate student. So I'm starting my lectures in organic chemistry. And in my second lecture, I'm on the blackboard discussing whether a reaction goes by an SN1 or SN2 reaction mechanism. And one of the students raises a hand and says, "Professor Wolf, what is an alcohol?" One of the most elemental questions. I asked him, I asked the class, and I realized that all my past experience wasn't applicable, that those students didn't have organic chemistry before. That was their first exposure to organic chemistry. So I literally took my lecture notes, put them in the waste paper basket, and said, okay, tomorrow we start fresh. So I started that, survived that first year. It was an interesting year because of that class, 50% either dropped out or didn't pass. But finished my saying, Glenhammer, come back, and I went back to chemistry. A year later, I get a call from the academic vice president, Milton Klötzel, who was a professor of chemistry, so I knew him from there. Says, "Walter, would you like to join the School of Pharmacy on a full-time basis?" Okay, tell me. Well, it's a trade school, and we feel we want a research school. We have hired a few people, but they haven't turned it around. I think you can turn it around. Said, okay, let me try. And when I finished, I told Milton, what you're really telling me, you want me to be the official troublemaker. And I normally add, and I haven't stopped being.
I was going to say, it fits you so beautifully.
So we did that. When that in 53, and in 63, we had 11 members on the faculty. We have now over 100. We had 2-3 people who had grants. Now practically everybody has. We have a tremendous research. So the transformation of the School of Pharmacy from a trade school into a research school was accomplished.
So that was during that key time from about 1960 to
that was in the early 1960s.
Yeah, okay. And then and one of the issues within the context of the development of the profession is to have a stronger professional role in terms of managing patients.
Okay. While during those years I was devoted of developing my research career, and I had been hired by Norman Karash to work on iodine chemistry, and that's what I was doing. And we found some interesting photochemical effects, so I went into, opened up some areas of photochemistry, and realized that it was probably a free radical mechanism, so we did a lot of free radical studies, etc. I'll talk a little bit about my scientific activities a little bit later, but you asked me about the professional aspects. While I was pushing developing the scientific aspect, I was uncomfortable with what we were doing professionally, because I continued having a tremendous interest that I continue having in health, in how to deliver health, etc. Remember, I had wanted to study medicine, but I didn't feel that was a satisfying thing. But still, the delivery of health and proper care of health was something important. And so I asked a professor of pharmacology at the medical school, and one who was very much in the community, etc., had met him, very good man. And John Biles, who was another faculty member who was had good ideas. We went to lunch in '65 at the faculty center, And the conclusion of that lunch was basically, if all we are going to do is educate people who are the middleman, middle person, between the big bottle and the little bottle, who all they do is count pills, we don't need a school of pharmacy. That's a waste of time. Nationally, for the student, for the profession, etc. We can teach that in a much shorter amount of time. We don't need 4 years to teach that. But at the same time, are there unmet needs? And that has always been part of what I'm looking for. Are there unmet needs of some kind that I can help? And I realized that one of the unmet needs, and I wasn't the only one realizing that, but there were a lot of people nationally who felt that way, was people in the health field knowledgeable about pharmacology. We needed people who were drug experts. Now, we had a unique situation at USC. We were a private university, so we had a lot of flexibility. We had the first one who started the Ph.D. And that in itself is another story, because I know what the stories are now about how the Ph.D. started, and I know what really happened.
Little revisionist history going on?
Well, I documented that, and if we have time I can mention that. But the need of educating specialists in drugs was there. So, being an experimentalist, we decided to test it. So we took pharmacy students, had them do rotations together with medical students, and again, examples, individual examples are illustrative. I had one young man, probably not the brightest one, but still good, who was went to a conference of Sabin. And after the conference, he was able to explain to the medical students what Sabin had said, because it was using the Michaelis-Menten equation and all kind of concepts, which if medical students had no idea what he was talking about. And this pharmacy student was able to explain that. And he told me the relationship suddenly changed completely. They realized I had knowledge they didn't have, and they could benefit from that. So we became partners. I was just a junior foreigner, tolerated there in the medical world, but I was a partner. I could help them. And that gave us the kind of thing that we needed, how to reform the career.
So you're dealing at that point with an individual discussion with your colleagues.
That's right.
Folks like John Biles, Glenn Hammer, trying to build this type of an environment. So it sounds like that was a very open governance structure. It was very participative, and people were really interested in trying to do it together. How has that evolved?
I wish I could say yes to that. It wasn't that way. People are resistant to change. Because I was a junior faculty member.
And the troublemaker.
And we needed to build a new building. I was made chairman of the building committee. So I looked around, studied the situation, etc. And I decided if we're going to give emphasis to the clinical, we needed to build a new building on the health sciences campus, which was just beginning. The medical school was just building up. So I came with a proposal to the committee to build the School of Pharmacy on the Health Sciences campus. The vote was 9-2 against. Given my Uruguayan background and everything, I was very respectful of democracy and majority, etc. But I also knew American history, so I used Lincoln's example. When a cabinet meeting, he was the only one voting for something, and he turned around and says, "The ayes have it." So I continued planning for the new campus, and the only person who had voted with me was John Biles. At that time, and again, because I was traveling back and forth in Washington for the new building, etc., I had made friends with people at the Bureau of Health Manpower, and we can cover that a little bit later. I had become interested in radiopharmacy, and I had toyed with the idea of creating a radiopharmacy specialty. There were no such thing as specialties in pharmacy.
And radiopharmacy is?
Okay, let me go into that in a moment. So in '68, I was given the opportunity of submitting a grant for the creation of a specialty in radiopharmacy. That was in April. As a matter of fact, it was the day before Martin Luther King got killed, because I was in Washington, and I had driven there, and I didn't go to Washington. I mean, my wife called me, "Get out of Washington, Washington is burning." I said, I looked out the window, I was close to the White House, I see nothing. Anyhow, I didn't go back to Washington, so that's why I know exactly the date. And that was in April of '68. In May, that grant was funded for 100% of what I asked for. And I can still kick myself that I didn't ask for more. Anyhow, when I came to pharmacy, let me go back now, how I got involved in radiopharmacy. Because my work in Paris was iodine chemistry, and at the same time, my work involved radioactive iodine at a time when that was just the very beginning, I became, by default, knowledgeable in radioactivity. I took a class with Irène Joliot-Curie, who was a professor at the Collège de France. So I have a direct linkage on that to the Curies. And at that time, we did a lot of things who hadn't been done before, not because we were trying to develop radioisotope methodology, but we had problems we needed to solve, and we developed empirical methods to do that. So when I came to USC, I knew something about iodine, I knew something about radioactive iodine, and there was a gentleman by the name of Manuel Tubis, who was at the VA Wadsworth, and who had been invited to give a course in radiopharmacy to nurses and other things at the School of Pharmacy. And so he kept asking me about iodine, and in '66 he convinced me to go to the first national meeting on radiopharmaceuticals in Oak Ridge. And I went. And we were sitting there one evening, and again, for historical purposes, we were sitting on the veranda of an old-time antebellum hotel, the Alexander in Oak Ridge. We were not drinking mint julep, but something like that. And again, I was probing what are the unmet needs. And the chairman of nuclear medicine at UCLA, George Taplin, looked at me and answered with one word: manpower. I said, okay, I'm an educator. I think I can do something about that. So Manny and I wrote up a program of a specialty in radiopharmacy for pharmacists. And I submitted that in '68 and got funded. And in '68 also, John Biles got elected Dean of the School of Pharmacy with a commitment to move towards clinical pharmacy. So the change to clinical pharmacy and the development of specialties came at the same time.
Okay.
And my main effort was the developing of the specialties. And it was quite interesting because, again, within the tradition of don't upset the apple cart, the ones who were most resistant to the creation of specialties was pharmacy. We haven't had specialties in pharmacy. We don't need it now. You're going to divide the pharmacy profession. Went ahead. We developed a specialty. There are now half a dozen of specialties. There's an American board of pharmaceutical specialties. The concepts are there. So from the point of view of my involvement in USC, I believe I have contributed to two things from a professional point of view. One is re-gearing, restructuring, reorienting the professional teaching towards clinical pharmacy and development of the professions. And I think that these are major changes, and USC has taken the lead.
Absolutely. So how did we ultimately get that transition to the health science campus?
Oh, we built the building and moved there.
So you had the funding for the building.
Yes.
And once you've got that, the space is there. So there wasn't a conceptual argument about if we're going to be clinically engaged, we have to be on a health science campus. It was the fact that the money was making it possible for building the building.
Yes. On the other side, while I have gotten involved with a hospital, and in addition to my academic appointment, I have a hospital appointment in radiopharmacy, I have been very unhappy that too few of our colleagues have, as I say, crossed the street. We have Zonal Avenue. On one side is a university, on the other side is a county hospital. That was before University Hospital, all that existed.
Sure.
And the separation remained. So although we were physically on the health sciences campus, people in the basic sciences did not participate in the clinical side. The concept of interdisciplinarity is something we pay lip service to, but practice in a limited manner.
Yeah. And you've really been distinctive in that area.
That is something I have pushed.
Yep, absolutely.
I have a lot of bruises to show for that.
Now, in the same vein, you've also been one of the first folks that I know of that became really involved on the governance side of things from the university side, coming from the health science campus. How did that evolve? How did that get going? And what are some of the issues that you were dealing with at the time?
Again, in the 60s, I was low man on the totem pole. I was a junior faculty member, so I got elected to the university senate. We called it that way. And after a few months, I resigned because I said, we're not doing anything. So that was my involvement at the early stages. Later on, and we were very involved in restructuring the school. I was involved in governance in the school, etc. We made changes there. And there was one event that propelled me into that. Oh yes, because you needed candidates who had been elected to the university council and some of those things, but I mean, wasn't really a major activity. There was something, I was coming back to this country. I'd been outside, I think I'd been in South America, and I read some press releases. And I read something about a Saudi gift for something called the East-West Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And something, I questioned that. And I asked questions. And when I ask questions and get evasive answers, my curiosity gets up. So we started asking more questions.
And I think that was 1971, 72?
No, that was 78.
78, okay.
That was
all right.
78.
Okay.
And so we had at that moment what is called the Battle of the Middle East Center. That East-West Foundation was proposing to establish at USC a Mideast Center funded by Saudi money that was going to give the degrees,
Mm-hmm.
but the university was signing but not controlling that. There was also, we got word of a meeting in Santa Barbara of the oil companies, and they were addressed by the Saudi Minister of Oil.
Mm-hmm.
And in a private meeting we're told, if you want to continue doing business in Saudi Arabia, with Saudi Arabia, you contribute to the East-West Foundation. Some of the people there were not happy with that. That information leaked. And we had a meeting outside USC at Hillel in which we got a report of that meeting, a report that had been transmitted to Los Angeles via Jerusalem. I let you guess what the source
Mm-hmm.
was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had now more information, and because I was a member of the Senate, I started asking questions in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And I circulated a motion to ask more questions. Everybody in the Senate signed it. There was a motion expressing no confidence in the Board of Trustees.
Mm-hmm.
And a few of us were in constant contact with trustees. There was one trustee in particular who had been assigned to me for contact, and that was John McCone.
Mm-hmm.
And John McCone, before being a trustee, had been chairman of the CIA.
Right, right.
And other things, but because in atomic energy and other things, he was illogical. And I brought some of the papers to his office. He looked at it and said, "Yes, Walter, in a prior job I had, I used to read some of those things." And there was a historic meeting of the Board of Trustees where John McCone led the charge and refused to accept the gift.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that meeting, the executive vice president of the university, Zorab Kaprillian, the president of the university, Jack Hubbard, and the chairman of the Board of Trustees, Bob Fleur, all had resigned or retired or whatever. As somebody said, faculty versus trustees,
Mm-hmm.
and they blinked. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That was a major change. And then there were a number of stories, etc. I won't go into the detail. But from that moment on, I remained very active in university governance.
So prior to that, there really wasn't that much faculty involvement at the university level per se. It might be more focused on individual schools or something along those lines.
Exactly, there were things, etc.
Uh-huh.
Because again, there's a rule I have found operative. The better and more effective the administration, the less the faculty has to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when there are problems that we go beyond that. And so the Thunberg years were an important healing process,
Mm-hmm.
where we changed, where we developed a number of things. And then it turns out I was nominated for president of the Faculty Senate. At that time we were called Faculty Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one thing that had bothered me for a long time. The Faculty Senate was very good in what I would call union issues. Salaries,
Sure.
parking, working conditions, etc. All very important, but very uninvolved in academic issues. And I felt that needed to change.
Mm-hmm.
So I had discussed a number of things, and I consider the retreat I had in 1990 a rather important event, in the sense I had selected 3 topics to be addressed. We didn't have a mission statement of the university. We, the faculty, wrote it. Afterwards, when Sample came, he adapted that and wrote a mission statement for the university 3 years after we had published ours. The second topic I felt was important was reorganizing the governance. We had a large Senate, some 200 and something members, and I realized that most of the action was taking place at the school, and the large Senate had very little influence in the school. So, as a matter of fact, Scott Bice, who at that time was Dean of Law School, had coined the phrase that he felt USC was one of the most balkanized universities in the country. Collection of independent schools, loosely held together by a, as Clark Kerr would have said, complaint on parking problems.
In office space.
In office space and so forth. But so the concept of creating faculty councils came up, many senates at the school, and that was one of the things. And that's still going on, and I consider that. And the third element, which I must confess I'm still unhappy that has taken so long in implementing, was faculty development. Just hiring somebody, promoting them, etc., and then letting them stagnate, I did not feel was a good idea. We needed to do something to enhance faculty development, and we are just beginning to go into that area.
Absolutely.
But
so
that was a grand thing.
How responsive were the trustees and also the university administration around some of these key issues? Because you're really talking about changing the whole way that faculty interacted from a content standpoint with regard to university development.
The administration was very responsive. We were able to work with the administration very well. More or less, Thunberg was very good, Sample was excellent. And so we had a good rapport. And then we continued since then. The trustees, we did not have the kind, we used to have some relation with the trustees, especially after the other one. But Thunberg, who was a Marine, was very uncomfortable with the enlisted people talking to the brass. So we did not have direct contact with the trustees. Some of us did on an individual basis,
Right.
even when it wasn't official. I use the analogy of putting a flower pot on the window if I wanted to talk to somebody. But we are human. There are all kind of stories I can tell there, but anyhow, that was the situation.
So how much of that faculty governance issue then do you think helped the university progress to the point that it is today?
I think by empowering faculty on taking responsibility, that has been very important. It's not only something they do, it's something we do. And so getting good leadership, getting active faculty buy-in and participation is very important and needs to be continued every time. And you know that perfectly well,
They're critical.
having
They're critical.
been there.
Absolutely. So if you think about the influences across the university, because you mentioned we've gone from very much a very localized kind of institution of higher education now to a global one. And you've talked about leadership at the administrative level, you've talked about leadership at the faculty level. Are there other elements that really have contributed to that make USC distinctive?
The fact that we have leadership, they have been able to assume leadership at various places, never as much as we would have liked to, but still. And so the key thing in all those years has been having good faculty. Nothing trumps that. Having good faculty who are committed, who are interested in developing a major research university, and who are working on that. And that continues to be the cornerstone of USC, of any research university.
Absolutely critical.
Now, one of the advantages, and I'm going back to pharmacy, etc., is that in the healthcare field, we have a unique advantage. We are a private university. None of the major research universities have a school of pharmacy, which means drug-related study and the application to clinical is something we can do things that are not that readily possible in other major private research universities. And state research universities have the problem, as one of our colleagues, Jordan Cohen, said years ago. He was dean at Iowa, and he's now vice president at Iowa. But he had been on the faculty here. He said, we have gone from a state-supported institution to a state-controlled institution. So the flexibility, the ability of state universities to be innovative is much more limited because they have powers they have to satisfy. We have the school, the trustees who don't interfere in general, and if we have ability to raise the funds to do what we want to do, and we have the support of the administration. By mean support, I mean more the conceptual support. It would be wonderful if the administration say, here a few $1 million you can use.
Right.
But we know that isn't always there, but the support in raising the money, in allowing us to test things, is very critical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, thinking to the future, what would you tell administration that we really need to focus on, that we need to keep in mind? Almost like principles or higher order issues that we have to always come back to.
Unleash and support the creativity of the faculty.
Mm-hmm.
The rest is commentary.
Okay.
I'm saying that standing on one foot.
And then what do you tell faculty that they need to do?
Be inventive. Be forward-looking. Don't think what has been done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Think, what are the issues that need to be solved, where are the roadblocks, and how they can be corrected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, what do we tell students as they're looking at this particular institution and where they need to go?
We are preparing you to meet intellectual challenges. We are not training you. I teach a course in medical oncology. My last lecture, I have a sentence which I always use. I have taught you about all the cancer drugs we are using today. I hope 10 or 20 years from now we don't use any of them because they're not good.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any better, but we need to get better ones. So be open, because things are going to change, and help making it change. Evolve. What you are taught today, what your career is today, is a preparation, but you are not going to be doing for the rest of your life the same thing you are doing now. I have one former student who is very active, who graduated in '72 when we had the first class graduating with a clinical pharmacy direction.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, we were sitting there and Biles was telling us it was up to us to build our career. And we were looking there. I thought we were going to something that was well established, where we now, that we have our degree, we could rest. And we are told, no, now you have to start. So we have that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we have the time, but let me add a few things
That'd be
on
great.
my own research.
Excellent.
I have over the years done a number of things in my own research, which again followed the kind of thing, addressing unmet needs.
Mm-hmm.
I started here with iodine chemistry and free radical chemistry and photochemistry. I had a few things I did which didn't work out. I went into polyvalent iodine, and that was fun, but didn't mean anything, so I dropped that. But the concept of what you could do with that was interesting. But then in the development of radiopharmacy, I looked at that after we started the career of radiopharmacist, said, fine, we are educating them of using the current radiopharmaceuticals, and most of them, or all of them, are used for diagnostic purposes. Are there other things that radiopharmaceuticals could be used for?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they can be used for treatment, and that also was being tested, but that's a limited field. But can we measure how drugs are distributed? Yes, we can take a patient, poke him right and left, take samples from blood and all kind of tissues, but that's not very comfortable for the patient.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one other thing. We are limited in the number of samples and the time course. So I said, can we do measurements of drug biodistribution using patient-friendly measurements? At the time, I started working with radioactive labeled drugs, and I started asking around, are there, in '68, are there any drugs that we could think of? And somebody said, well, there's a new drug that somebody in Wisconsin just developed called 5-fluorouracil.
Mm-hmm.
It has a fluorine atom, and therefore it might be labeled intrinsically, and etc., with fluorine 18. And I went to talk to one of the oncologists, and he said, well, what would you like to know? What do you need to know? What are the unmet needs? And his answer was, I want to know why some patients are responding and others are not,
Mm-hmm.
and how much should I give it? In my youthful enthusiasm, I said, oh, that's a simple question. I can answer that in 2-3 years. Well, it's basically 25, 30 years later, and I still haven't answered it. But in the process, I've developed methods, how we can measure that, what we can measure, develop techniques for measurements.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole concept of how we can predict and measure response so that we decide what is the optimal amount of a drug is what I considered right now my main activity. And again, it follows the general principle: is there an unmet need,
Mm-hmm.
and is there something I can do about it? And so going back to what you had asked a few minutes ago, what is my advice? Support the faculty in being creative. Identify unmet needs and try to address them. That's how progress will be made.
Well, terrific, Walter. Have we covered, have we missed anything that we need to talk about in more detail?
Well, as I sometimes say, I'm a professor, so I'm trained to give long answers to short questions. Yes, I can talk, but I think I have tried to summarize. And while I could go into detail on many things, at this moment, that wouldn't really, I feel.
As usual, you've given eloquent answers to maybe some questions that are not as deep as we might like, but also, as always, I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with you about some of these. You clearly have demonstrated why you're a university professor dealing across multiple disciplines and multiple organizational issues, and that's absolutely key to your involvement in this university, Walter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.